within 2 weeks, we had a full version of the software application running in Tokyo, Japan. Hello and welcome to the Get Into Cloud podcast. I'm your host, Quinn Graham. Today we're talking about very basic subject of why cloud. And if you're thinking about pursuing cloud careers, you need to understand the value prop of going to the cloud as opposed to on-prem solutions. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story that kind of explains how I was introduced first to cloud and how I decided to start to make that transition. And it was a number of years ago. I was working at a startup software company, and the company was doing really well. We were growing really fast. I was in the data center team at the time. We were building a lot of new environments, and we were doing VMware and running these applications on Dell servers and some Blade chassis and EMC SANs and that sort of stack and technology. But we had a problem. We were growing outside of the United States, and we had our first sales person in Japan. The long and the short is that the salesperson wasn't selling, and they went to the CEO and they said that they weren't selling because the data center was in the US and that Japanese companies did not want to buy software where the data was hosted outside of Japan. And this was shortly after the Patriot Act was passed in the US. And as you get into IT, you'll learn a lot about how data locality matters. A lot of countries outside of the United States don't want their data to come into the United States because they don't want the US government to have dominion over their data. So you'll find that companies inside the United States don't really want their data to go outside of it, and that companies in Europe and Asia don't want their data to come into the US. So we were at a little bit of a quandary, and the CEO came to us and said, "Hey, I need a data center in Japan." And like good data center folks, we got to work. We started thinking about what would it look like for us to build a data center in Japan, and we came up with this idea. My manager at the time thought, we could build a single rack and put all of the hardware, physical hardware we needed to run the application. In fact, we could probably scale up to maybe 100 apps, 100 clients in one single rack. And that rack would have some servers to run VMware and virtualization. That rack would have a couple of physical boxes to run SQL. Back in the, I'll call it the olden days, the DBAs would say that you couldn't run SQL on VMware. You couldn't virtualize SQL, which is, we've come a long way since then. But we plan to have some physical servers to run SQL Server on, and then a small SAN at the bottom and networking switches at the top. We had this idea, we would take this rack, we'd order all of this hardware, we would install everything in this rack, we would wrap it up and put it on a boat, ship it to Japan, and have it installed in a colo in Japan. And I think we probably took us a week to come up with the bill of materials for this, and the price was just astronomical. I think $500,000, and that doesn't even include the shipping or the data center. It was just hardware and support and licensing and everything to try to get this app up. And we gave the bill of materials to our manager, our senior manager. He went to the CEO. He came back a day later and said, "No, build it in the cloud." And of course, none of us knew what that meant at the time. And we started to then investigate. So we looked around. At that time, AWS had a region in Tokyo. So we got the company credit card and we started poking around, and we started deploying servers. Now at that time, I can't even remember what services were available. That was a long time ago. Lambda wasn't even a service then. But we just decided to deploy a bunch of EC2 instances, so kind of standard infrastructure VMs. And then we built out the app. We created a new domain because everything was Windows-based and AD connected. And then we had the app installed by the application team. The DBAs complained about the database being virtualized, but we were able to get beyond that. And then we were able to get the app up. And within 2 weeks, we had a full version of the software application running in Tokyo, Japan. And that was for a fraction of the cost of what it would cost a physical for physical servers, because there's just a number of EC2 instances. And so at that time, I knew that cloud was going to be the future of data center technology. We were able to accomplish more building in AWS than we'd even accomplished just writing up a physical bill of materials. So it was pretty incredible. So then looking forward, as my career progressed, I was able to work in cloud and specifically consulting around AWS. And that's when the real advantages of cloud started to become known to me. And there are a lot. I want to talk a little bit about the key advantages, and you should be familiar with them so that when you have those cloud discussions, you're able to talk intelligently about the advantages that cloud brings to the table. The first one is flexibility. Cloud is extremely flexible given the number of services that are available. In most of the clouds, they have a number of services that you can take advantage of. In terms of flexibility, just being able to deploy in another region. So if you're in Japan today and you want to be in Singapore tomorrow, or India, or in Frankfurt, it's a click of a button to deploy your application into a new region in a new country. When you look at that from a colo facility, there's just no comparison. One of the big advantages is agility. So you're able to quickly be able to spin up new infrastructure to try out new types of services and not have to wait. When you're using or doing infrastructure on-prem, it could take weeks just to figure out what type of server that you need to purchase. And you have to spend a lot of time up front figuring out exactly what you're going to need, maybe 1 to 2 years out into the future, because once you make a purchase of a server, you can't send that back. You have so much time and money and effort invested in installing a server into a rack in your colo facility or in your private data center that you can't just pull it back out and send it back to whoever the manufacturer is. So you spend so much time up front trying to figure out what it is you need to buy. And so a lot of time is just wasted. Months and months and months are wasted trying to get it perfect before you can install, until you can purchase, even just purchasing, much less installing and making it available to your business users. So cloud agility is huge. You can stand up an environment in minutes and then tear that environment back down if it's not needed. If it's sized incorrectly, you can just change it. And you see that all the time with cost optimization and things like this in the cloud, where your job is to go through and just to make small changes to the environment or large changes to the environment to make it more cost effective. One of the other advantages is innovation. So obviously, if you are a customer, we see this a lot actually today with large language models, right? If you are in an on-prem environment, the idea that you would be able to go buy a bunch of servers that have video cards in them and to be able to test generative AI and LLMs, large language models, things like ChatGPT, it's just prohibitively expensive, but also who's going to green light a project where you haven't figured out what the ROI for that project would be? In the cloud, you can spin those up, potentially invest some time and money to test out some new technology, in this case, like large language models, but it could be testing out a new type of database, maybe a key store database performance as opposed to your, a relational database, or maybe you would like to try out MongoDB versus another type of database, or maybe you want to play around with replacing your existing application with containers or serverless. These are the kinds of things that you can try out and test from an innovation perspective, and then decide whether you want to keep them or not. Another advantage is elasticity, scalability. These are kind of typically used interchangeably, but the idea is that the cloud is able to expand and contract as needed. The elasticity and scalability means that you can just consume the compute and that you need when you need it. So if your website is busy, you can add more servers to be able to, or more containers or more Lambda functions to be able to consume the activity and traffic. And then when your website gets less busy, you scale that back in. So you eliminate those. If you have serverless, you don't have to scale that. But if you have EC2 instances or something along this line, or VMs, then those can be terminated and deleted, and you're no longer paying for those. And so it's a huge advantage. So that advantage plays into cost, right? If you have re-architected your application when you moved it to the cloud, then you can take advantage of scalability and elasticity. You can take advantage of turning systems off when they're not in use. There's a lot of ways that you can look to save money when you move to the cloud. If you take a system as it sits on-prem and you do a one-to-one price comparison to the cloud, then the cloud will always look more expensive. So this is the lift and shift problem. If you take a server on-prem and you move it to the cloud as is, you're likely going to spend a considerable amount more. But the advantage of the cloud is many, if not most, on-prem systems are overpowered because you necessarily need to size a server 2 to 3 years into the future, right? You don't want to, if you buy a server and you install an application on it, you can't reinstall it on a new server every year. So you need the server that you buy to be really large so that you don't have to touch it for 2 to 3 years. So you're already, all of that space that you purchase out is waste. You've wasted that money to cover you for the next couple of years. In the cloud, you don't have to do that. You can size the server exactly, or the container exactly for your application today. And as it grows, you can either take advantage of scaling, but if the application doesn't support scaling, then you can just step up the server as you go. Another big advantage is security. So security is a big deal, certainly now in the age with so many hackers that are trying to attack companies and get access to your data. On-prem, there's typically there's just less security. I guess that's probably the best way to put it bluntly. The security is mostly a perimeter security. So once folks are inside of the network is considered to be safe. It's typical for traffic inside of the network to be in the clear and no encryption to be used inside the network. I've seen in many cases, servers in the network will all be separated by subnets, and those subnets will have no firewall between individual VMs or servers that sit on the same subnet. The traffic in the network only gets inspected when you travel from one subnet to another subnet. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works when I do a podcast about networking. And then there's rarely ever encryption, hardware disk encryption, rarely done at the SAN and rarely done at the server level. You really see a lot more strenuous security in cloud that's kind of built in with security groups and encryption and things like this. One of the last advantages I'll talk about is multi-region NDR. You know, when you think about an on-prem data center, if you have a data center and let's say it costs $5 million, your data center has all the hardware to run production and all these things in it. If you want to have a DR facility, the DR facility needs to be one-to-one sized to your production environment. And so that if you had a disaster event in your primary data center, your secondary data center, your DR data center would need to be able to run all of your applications, your production applications. And so it's going to be very large, very costly, but yet but you're not going to use that. That data center will sit idle, effectively waiting for a DR event. Now, sometimes you can use that data center for, dev or staging. You could try to redeem some of those dollars, but at the end of the day, you're paying 2x for your production environment, and only one of those will be used. But in a cloud scenario, you can literally build a second copy of your production environment and then turn it off. And effectively, you'll be paying for the storage that is replicated to the other environment. Depending on your RTO and RPO, you may only have a couple of things running. You might have databases running that are keeping current with your production. But you could potentially even have a database in your DR cloud environment that's much, much smaller than your production database, because all it's going to be receiving are writes, and it just needs to stay current with your production database. So in most cases, database use cases are, some mixed of read and write, and so your DR database could be much smaller in the cloud. Or you might just be doing backups, daily backups to another region. And in the event of a disaster, then you could turn on and hydrate your production DR environment and then begin paying for it. But it's a fraction of the cost. When I look at the numbers on-prem, it's like a 2.5x maybe, because not only do you have to have two sets of production infrastructure, you have to have all of the interconnectedness, all of the software, everything that you need to transfer all the data from one side to the other. It's very expensive. So you might need to have dark fiber in place. You might need to have very large internet pipes to be able to transfer data from one to the other. In the cloud, it's really like a 1.25. So whatever your primary costs, maybe a quarter of those costs will go into your DR in the cloud. Now, of course, that depends on if you're a data heavy client, or your applications are super data heavy, or your database is very busy and a lot of writes, then you might have more, but it's nowhere close to the price that you deal with on-prem. So that's it. That's a bunch of that's a ton of advantages of the cloud over on-prem. There are obviously more, but those are the heavy hitters in my opinion. Those are the ones that really move the needle for folks when they start to think about going into the cloud and moving off-prem. It's the fact that the business is waiting 3 months, 4 months, 6 months to get a server in place, to get a database available. They want to try something with large language models, and the data center guys just say no. They say no. There's not any video cards available for them to test with. And so it's that constant telling the business no, shutting down innovation in the company, shutting down agility and flexibility that forces folks to start to look seriously at the cloud and make those changes. Now, for you, how can you get started learning about the cloud story and understanding why cloud? I think probably the best place to start is the Cloud Practitioner's Exam for AWS. This is an exam that is focused on AWS, but it really does help to paint the picture of what you get when you go into when you start to utilize cloud and the advantages there in terms of the services, the basic services that AWS provides. So it's a great starting place to learn about cloud, to get your first certification under your belt, and start to get familiar with AWS. That brings us to the end of the episode. Hope this information was helpful to you. Please connect with me on LinkedIn and check out the next episode. We're going to talk about which cloud you should look into first. Have a good one. Thanks.